By the end of The Sopranos, Tony has avoided prison for years, even as the FBI slowly builds a case around him. Most discussions focus on whether Tony dies in the final scene. There is another possibility the show leaves hanging over him. Tony survives, gets arrested, and finally has to answer for everything the government can prove. If that happens, how long would his sentence actually be? The danger becomes much more serious in the final episodes because Carlo disappears and is believed to be cooperating with the FBI. Carlo is not some low-level associate who only heard rumors. He is a captain who has spent years inside Tony's organization, and he can explain how the family operates, identify the people involved, and connect Tony directly to crimes that investigators may have struggled to prove on their own. Tony's lawyer, Neil Mink, warns him that an indictment is probably coming and says Carlo's testimony could support several serious charges. So, for this hypothetical, Tony is not being arrested for every crime we watched him commit. He is being prosecuted for the crimes the government can prove through witnesses, recordings, financial records, and the people around him who are willing to cooperate. That difference will decide whether Tony receives a manageable prison term or spends the rest of his life behind bars. The most likely foundation of the case would be RICO, which stands for the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO allows federal prosecutors to treat a criminal organization and its connected offenses as one continuing enterprise. Instead of proving that Tony personally carried out every act, prosecutors could argue that he directed an organization whose members repeatedly committed crimes such as extortion, illegal gambling, loan sharking, fraud, bribery, and murder. That approach fits Tony extremely well because he usually protects himself by keeping some distance from the details. He gives an order, approves a decision, or makes his wishes clear while another member handles the actual crime. RICO exists partly to deal with leaders who operate in exactly that way. Being careful enough to avoid holding the murder weapon does not help much when the government can prove that you controlled the people holding it. Under federal law, a basic RICO conviction can carry up to 20 years in prison. The maximum can rise to life when the case includes a criminal act that can itself be punished with life imprisonment, such as murder. RICO also allows the government to take property and money connected to the criminal organization. Tony would therefore be fighting for his freedom, his money, and potentially parts of the legitimate-looking life he used that money to build. The 20-year maximum does not mean Tony would automatically receive 20 years. Federal sentencing begins with the offenses the jury finds proven, followed by a calculation based on the seriousness of the underlying crimes, Tony's role, the amount of money involved, his criminal record, and several other factors. In a racketeering case, the sentencing rules generally look at the underlying criminal activity and use whichever calculation produces the higher punishment. A RICO case based mainly on gambling will look very different from one involving murder. Tony would also receive very little benefit from pretending he was only loosely involved. He is the boss, makes major decisions, settles disputes, divides territory, approves killings, and receives money from several crews. Federal sentencing rules can increase the punishment when a defendant led a criminal operation involving 5 or more people. Tony's organization easily clears that requirement. The government would still need to prove its case, and that is where Carlo becomes important. Carlo's cooperation would give the FBI something it had been missing for years, a senior member who could explain how Tony's organization actually worked. Investigators may already have recordings, financial records, and information from previous informants, but those pieces become much stronger when Carlo can identify the people involved and explain Tony's role in their crimes. This would place Tony in real danger of being indicted as the head of the family even when he kept himself away from the details. Tony was usually careful enough to let other people handle those details, which is useful until one of those people starts explaining them to the FBI. Carlo would be especially valuable because he took over construction interests after Vito's death and was involved in some of the family's most profitable operations. He would know how money reached Tony, which businesses were being extorted, how jobs were divided, and which members acted on Tony's instructions. He could also explain the language used in conversations that might sound harmless to an outsider. Mob cases often depend on that kind of interpretation. Tony rarely sits down and announces that he is ordering a federal crime. He speaks through suggestions, complaints, questions, and unfinished sentences because everyone around him already understands the system. Carlo could tell a jury what those conversations meant inside the organization. Suddenly, an unclear recording is being explained by someone who participated in the same business. The defense would attack Carlo immediately. Neil Mink would present him as a criminal trying to protect his son and reduce his own punishment. Every lie Carlo told, every crime he committed, and every benefit offered by prosecutors would be placed in front of the jury. Mink would argue that Carlo had discovered a very convenient memory once his family needed help. That attack could work with some jurors, especially if the government relied entirely on Carlo. The FBI would therefore try to support his claims with independent evidence. Carlo's job would be to provide the map. Recordings, money transfers, business records, surveillance, and other witnesses would need to show that he was pointing in the right direction. The FBI had already spent years collecting pieces of Tony's criminal life. Ray Curto secretly recorded conversations while serving as an informant. Jack cooperated and gave agents information about Tony's involvement in construction. Adriana provided information about activity at the Crazy Horse, even though much of what she knew concerned Christopher rather than Tony. Pussy had also cooperated before disappearing. Several of those witnesses were dead by the finale, which creates obvious problems, although their cooperation could still have led investigators toward records and evidence that existed independently of them. The FBI would not simply place a dead informant's entire story before the jury as if he were available for questioning. Neil Mink would challenge anything Tony could not properly confront in court. Still, investigations do not forget everything because the original informant dies. Leads can produce surveillance, documents, new witnesses, and separate evidence that remains usable. Carlo could bring those older pieces into a clearer structure. His testimony might explain why certain companies received contracts, how no-show jobs were distributed, who collected money, and how much eventually moved upward to Tony. That makes construction one of the strongest areas for prosecutors because it creates records. Murder can happen in private. A contract, payroll arrangement, or payment generally leaves something behind, even when everyone involved wishes it had been handled in cash behind satrials. The construction schemes could support charges involving racketeering, extortion, fraud, bribery, and labor corruption. Tony and the family used threats and influence to control unions, obtain jobs, interfere with contracts, and collect money from legitimate projects. The exact charges would depend on which transaction investigators could document, but some forms of federal extortion can be punished with up to 20 years for each count. Tony's position would make the situation worse. The money flows upward because he is the boss. He settles disputes over percentages because everyone recognizes his authority. When Ralph, Vito, Carlo, or another captain earns heavily through construction, Tony receives his share. Carlo would not need to claim that Tony personally threatened every contractor. He could describe an organized system that operated under Tony's protection and for Tony's benefit. The Esplanade would be particularly useful because it connects the New Jersey and New York families to a major construction project. Tony is directly involved in disputes over money, work stoppages, no-show jobs, and the division of proceeds. The project also involves Assemblyman Ronald Zellman and a union official. The number of people involved creates more opportunities for records and witnesses. It also makes Tony's claim of being an ordinary waste management consultant harder to maintain, although he certainly committed to that performance. The construction evidence leads naturally into Tony's fraud schemes, especially the housing and urban development operation involving Zellman and Maurice. In that scheme, properties are purchased through a front arrangement and sold at inflated prices to a non-profit organization. The purchase is paid for using government-backed housing funds. The buildings are supposed to be renovated for low-income housing, while the people involved take the money and leave the properties in poor condition. Tony is directly involved in creating the operation. He learns how a similar scheme works and uses his political relationship with Zellman to make his own version possible. Maurice becomes involved through the non-profit side, while Ralph and other members help carry out the plan. The arrangement could expose Tony to fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and racketeering charges if prosecutors obtain testimony or financial records connecting him to the proceeds. The strength of that part of the case would depend on who cooperated and what records remained. Carlo may know that the family profited from the scheme without knowing every conversation that created it. Zellman and Maurice would be much more dangerous because they participated directly and have respectable lives to protect. Faced with a federal indictment, either man might decide that loyalty to Tony was less important than avoiding prison. Tony has a remarkable ability to inspire loyalty right up until the sentencing rules are placed on the table. Fraud sentences depend heavily on the amount of money lost, the number of victims, the amount of planning involved, and the defendant's role. A single fraud count can carry a maximum of 20 years, although the actual sentence may be much lower. When fraud becomes part of a broader racketeering case and is combined with extortion, gambling, and Tony's leadership role, the punishment can grow quickly. Illegal gambling would be easier to establish, although it would probably produce a smaller sentence by itself. Tony's family runs sports betting, card games, and other gambling operations throughout the series. Tony supervises the people operating them, settles major debts, and benefits financially. Federal law allows up to 5 years for conducting or financing a qualifying illegal gambling business involving at least 5 people. The executive card game gives us a clear example of how Tony's gambling business works. Wealthy players are brought into a controlled environment, the family takes a percentage, and credit is extended to people who may not be able to repay it. Davy's collapse shows what happens after that credit becomes debt. Tony allows him to continue gambling, takes control of his sporting goods business through the debt, and extracts value until the business is destroyed. Davy could provide direct testimony about Tony's involvement, although his own choices and desperate financial position would give the defense room to challenge him. The documents from the business might be more useful. Orders, invoices, credit records, travel tickets, and the sudden collapse of a previously legitimate store could support the story. Tony may describe what happened as Davy losing a game and paying what he owed. Prosecutors would describe an illegal gambling and extortion operation that used debt to take control of a business. Both descriptions cover the same events. Only one sounds acceptable in court. Loan sharking would create a similar problem. Tony's organization regularly lends money at extreme interest rates and uses threats or violence to collect it. Under federal law, Knowingly participating in the collection of a loan through violence or threats can carry up to 20 years in prison. Once again, prosecutors would need more than a general claim that mobsters lend money. They would need borrowers, collectors, records, recordings, or a cooperating member who could identify specific loans. Carlo may know about debts managed by his crew and payments sent upward. Other members could confirm how the system operated if they were also charged and decided to cooperate. By the end of the series, that possibility is becoming easier to imagine. Christopher is dead, Bobby is dead, Silvio is in a coma, Vito, Ralph, Eugene, Pussy, Jimmy, and several other experienced members are gone. Polly remains, although Polly's loyalty has always worked best when loyalty is the safest available option. Patsy remains and may have reasons to resent Tony. Carlo has already chosen his family over the organization. The structure protecting Tony has become much thinner and every new arrest could produce another witness. Prosecutors often use that pressure deliberately. They do not need every defendant to cooperate. They need enough evidence to charge several people, then offer each one a reason to speak before someone else accepts the deal. Tony has spent years encouraging fear and self-interest among his subordinates. Those qualities become less useful when the FBI gives them a different person to fear. The gun charge mentioned by Neil Mink would add another part to the indictment. Tony was arrested after a gun he discarded while fleeing Johnny Sack's home was recovered and eventually connected to him. The local authorities initially handled the case, but the federal government showed interest in using it as part of the larger prosecution. The gun itself would probably not create the largest sentence unless Tony's record or the exact features of the weapon produced a more serious federal charge. Its greater value would be strategic. Prosecutors could place it alongside the racketeering allegations, giving the jury another example of Tony possessing something he should not have and lying about his connection to it. Neil Mink could challenge how the weapon was recovered and whether the evidence proved Tony knowingly possessed it. Compared with Carlo describing years of organized crime, the gun is a side problem, although Tony had reached the stage where even his side problems came with federal agents. Tax charges are another realistic possibility. Tony reports income through legitimate positions such as Barone Sanitation, yet his lifestyle is supported by large amounts of criminal income. He owns an expensive home, keeps cash hidden, and pays for boats, cars, gambling, gifts, hotel rooms, and other expenses that would be difficult to explain through his reported salary alone. The government could compare Tony's declared income with his spending and assets. Hidden cash creates fewer records at the moment it is earned, but it creates questions when it is spent. Carmela's investments, the house, the boat, and Tony's business interests could all receive attention. Under federal law, tax evasion can carry up to 5 years for each proven count. Tax charges would not necessarily place Tony in prison for the rest of his life, but they give prosecutors another option when the source of the money is easier to demonstrate than the crime that produced it. The government may struggle to prove exactly who Tony extorted to receive a particular sum while still proving that he earned far more than he reported. Illegal income remains taxable, which feels slightly unfair only if your accountant received his training from Polly Walnuts. All of those financial and racketeering offenses could produce a serious sentence. Murder is what could turn the case into life imprisonment. Tony personally kills several people during the series. He strangles Fabian while visiting colleges with Meadow. He participates in Pussy's murder on the boat. He kills Ralph during their fight, shoots Tony B, and suffocates Christopher after the car crash. He also orders or approves several killings carried out by other members. Watching Tony commit those murders gives the audience certainty. A jury would have a much narrower view. Prosecutors need admissible evidence establishing the killing, Tony's involvement, and the connection to the criminal organization. Many of Tony's murders happen with no surviving witness willing to testify. Fabian's death would be difficult to connect to the New Jersey investigation. The murder takes place in Maine, years earlier, and Tony leaves little direct evidence behind. Carlo probably knows nothing useful about it. Fabian was an informant, which gives Tony a motive, but motive alone does not identify the killer. Pussy's murder could become part of a racketeering case because he was killed for cooperating with the FBI. Tony, Silvio, and Polly participate, leaving Silvio incapacitated and Polly as the only living eyewitness besides Tony. The body is disposed of at sea. Carlo may strongly suspect what happened, as much of the family probably does, but suspicion from another criminal is still suspicion. Without physical evidence or testimony from Polly, the government would struggle to prove the murder beyond a reasonable doubt. Ralph's death has a similar problem. Tony kills him inside Ralph's home and calls Christopher to help dispose of the body. Christopher would have been a devastating witness because he saw the aftermath and helped Tony cut up the body. By the finale, Christopher is dead, and Tony is responsible for that as well. Ralph's disappearance looks suspicious, but there is no body available and no living witness shown to have direct knowledge of Tony killing him. Christopher's death would be nearly impossible to prosecute as murder based on the available evidence. The official explanation is that he died from injuries after the crash. Tony is alone with him and suffocates him without leaving an obvious public sign of what happened. The medical examination might raise questions, though nothing in the series suggests investigators discovered evidence of murder. Tony's ability to turn an impulsive killing into a believable accident may be one of the bleakest examples of his experience working in his favor. Tony B's death offers a clearer motive and a body, but Tony kills him alone at the farmhouse. Members of both families know Tony was under pressure to hand Tony B over to Phil, and Tony later admits enough for people to understand that he resolved the problem himself. Turning that understanding into courtroom proof would require a witness, physical evidence, or a statement that could be used properly at trial. The murders Tony orders may give prosecutors a better chance because more people are involved. Adriana's murder requires Christopher to inform Tony, Tony to contact Silvio, and Silvio to drive her into the woods. By the finale, Christopher is dead, Silvio cannot testify, and Adriana's body has not been found. Carlo may know or believe that the family killed her after learning she was an informant, although his knowledge may come from conversations after the murder rather than direct participation. Phil's murder occurs shortly before Carlo disappears. Tony approves the operation, and several surviving members participate in locating or killing Phil. Carlo was involved in the war with New York and could potentially describe Tony's decision to have Phil killed. Yet Phil was the head of a rival criminal family who had already ordered attacks on Tony, Bobby, and Silvio. Plenty of people had reasons to want him dead. Prosecutors would still need evidence connecting Tony's order to Walden and the other men at the gas station. This creates the central uncertainty in Tony's sentence. If the FBI proves racketeering based on gambling, extortion, loan sharking, construction corruption, and fraud, Tony probably receives a long sentence measured in decades. If the government successfully includes a murder as part of the racketeering case, life imprisonment becomes much more realistic. Federal RICO law allows a life sentence when the underlying criminal activity can also be punished with life imprisonment. The federal sentencing rules follow the same basic idea. They calculate a racketeering sentence according to the most serious criminal conduct proven as part of the case. If that conduct is first-degree murder, the recommended sentence would normally be life. I would not make murder the center of the most realistic indictment because the series has removed most of the witnesses who could prove one. Carlo gives the government broad inside knowledge, but there is no clear evidence that he personally witnessed Tony order or commit a specific murder. He may know about Phil, Adriana, or another killing, and further investigation could reveal evidence we never see. Based only on what the show gives us, the financial and organizational crimes are safer for prosecutors. Even without murder, Tony's position as boss would push the sentence upward. The case could involve numerous victims, several schemes, large amounts of criminal income, threats, violence, leadership responsibility, and activity continuing over many years. Tony would also have difficulty receiving a reduced sentence for accepting responsibility if he went to trial and denied everything. A guilty plea could lower his punishment, but Tony would have to accept a conviction and give up the chance of beating the case. Tony might take a plea if the evidence became overwhelming. He is stubborn, although he is not completely irrational about prison. He understands what happened to Johnny Sack, who eventually pleaded guilty and received a 15-year sentence. Tony criticizes Johnny for publicly admitting the existence of organized crime, showing that reputation still matters to him even while another boss is dying in federal custody. That reaction tells us Tony would resist any plea requiring a broad admission about the family. At the same time, Tony has never treated principle as more important than survival for very long. If Neil Mink showed him that a trial could produce 30 years or life while a plea offered 12 to 15, Tony would seriously consider it. He would complain about the humiliation, question the government's evidence, insult Carlo, and eventually ask whether the agreement protected his remaining money. Tony's moral code becomes flexible whenever the alternative has locked doors. A plea could bring the sentence closer to 15 years depending on the charges dismissed and the agreement reached. Johnny Sack's case gives the show's clearest comparison, although Johnny's charges and evidence are not identical to Tony's. Johnny receives 15 years after accepting a deal, giving up millions in assets and admitting his position in the New York family. Tony could face a similar result if prosecutors wanted certainty and Tony wanted to avoid the possibility of dying in prison. Going to trial would create a much wider range. If Tony were convicted of one RICO count supported by crimes other than murder, the maximum for that count would normally be 20 years. Separate convictions for extortion, loan sharking, fraud, gambling, tax evasion, and weapons offenses could add further punishment. Courts do not simply add the maximum punishment for every charge and announce the total. Some charges would be grouped together, and many sentences could run at the same time. Others could be added together when necessary to reach the final sentence. The federal sentencing rules in place when the series ended would provide a starting point rather than a guaranteed answer. A judge would examine the recommended range and also consider the nature of Tony's crimes, his history, the danger he presented to the public, and sentences given to similar defendants. Tony's health and family situation would probably have limited effect. He suffers from depression and panic attacks, has been shot, and could present medical evidence about his condition. Those facts might influence where the judge sentenced him within the available range, but they would not erase decades of organized crime. The government would also point out that Tony continued directing the family after being shot and remained capable of running complex criminal operations. It would be difficult to describe him as too fragile for prison after proving he supervised extortion and violence. His lack of a major previous prison sentence could help slightly. Tony has been arrested before and has a record, but he has avoided the kind of convictions that would automatically place him among the most heavily punished repeat offenders. His limited official record looks better on paper than his real history. That is another benefit of being successful at crime for a long time. The sentencing report may initially be more polite than the evidence. Once Tony entered federal prison, he would also face a system with no traditional parole offenses committed during this period. Federal prisoners can earn a limited reduction for good conduct, currently up to 54 days for each year of the sentence. That still leaves them serving most of the punishment imposed by the judge. A 20-year sentence could therefore mean approximately 17 years if Tony received the maximum available credit for good behavior. Tony is around 47 when the series ends. A sentence imposed after an investigation and trial could keep him imprisoned until his mid to late 60s. A 30-year sentence could keep him there into his 70s. A life sentence would settle the issue completely. That age matters because Tony's authority depends on active control. He needs to meet captains, settle conflicts, distribute money, approve promotions, and respond when New York moves against him. He could communicate through lawyers and visitors, but the family waiting outside is already damaged. Bobby is dead. Silvio may never recover. Carlo is cooperating. Christopher is dead. Polly has survived, which is useful if the organization needs someone to worry about a cat and avoid accepting new responsibilities. Tony might retain some influence from prison, especially during the early years, but his control would weaken as money disappeared and younger members formed relationships without him. Carmela would also face the loss of Tony's illegal income, enormous legal expenses, and the possibility that the government would take assets connected to his criminal activity. The lifestyle Tony claimed to provide for his family would become part of the evidence used to dismantle it. This practical consequence matters more than the difference between 22 and 26 years. Tony has built his life around immediate access to power. People answer his calls because he can reward them or harm them. Prison would place every conversation under rules controlled by someone else, even if he remained respected. Respect from a prison visiting room offers fewer benefits than the version he enjoyed at the Bing. After looking at the evidence, my best estimate is that Tony would receive somewhere between 20 and 30 years if he went to trial and was convicted in a serious racketeering case without a provable murder. A plea agreement could reduce that to roughly 12 to 15 years, especially if prosecutors valued certainty, and Tony agreed to give up a large amount of money and property. If Carlo or another witness gave the government enough evidence to prove that Tony ordered a murder connected to the organization, Tony could receive life. I would place the most likely outcome near 25 years. That estimate gives proper weight to Tony's leadership, the length of his criminal activity, the number of schemes involved, and the possibility of separate convictions for extortion, fraud, gambling, loan sharking, tax offenses, and the gun charge. It also avoids pretending that prosecutors could prove every murder simply because the audience watched Tony commit them. Tony would probably appeal, challenge Carlo's credibility, and spend years claiming that the government built its case around liars and criminals. On that final point, he would even be correct. The problem is that nearly everyone capable of explaining Tony's business would be a liar and a criminal because those are the people Tony chose to conduct business with. My final answer is 25 years. With life imprisonment remaining possible if the case included a murder the government could actually prove. Tony might eventually leave prison as an old man under the lower estimate, but his time as the boss of North Jersey would end the moment the sentence was imposed. The FBI would never need to solve every crime from all 6 seasons. It would only need to prove enough of them to take away the part of Tony's life he still had left.